Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Today, we return to a case that's haunted American headlines for more than 3 decades, the Menendez brothers. Two sons, Lyle and Erik Menendez, who on August 20th, 1989, walked into their parents' den in a Beverly Hills mansion and killed José and Kitty Menendez. Were they cold-blooded killers motivated by greed, or were they battered, terrified young men who believed they were acting to survive? And why does this case keep coming back, legally and culturally, long after the juries and the cameras moved on? With me is Dr. Rafael Cortez. Rafael, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Maya. It's good to be here. This case has everything that keeps forensic psychologists up at night. Family violence, allegations of chronic sexual abuse, questions about perception and imminence, and then the legal machinery that tries to translate trauma into culpability.
Right. Before we dig into specifics, Rafael, can you tell listeners, briefly, what your lens will be on this? What kinds of questions do you tend to ask when you look at a family homicide like this?
Sure. At the most basic level, I'm asking, what was the lived experience of each brother, developmentally and psychologically, leading up to that night? How do long-term abuse and coercive control shape threat perception and behavioral options? And then, crucially, how do legal standards, like imminent threat for self-defense or the bar for diminished capacity, map on to those psychological realities? I try to keep one foot in the science and one in the legal definitions.
Good. Let's start at the beginning. The family portrait. The Menendez family looked like a classic American success story. José, a Cuban immigrant who rose through corporate ranks, Hertz, RCA records, built wealth and status. Kitty, a former school teacher and on-time beauty queen, 2 privileged sons with tennis training, and a Beverly Hills house on Elm Drive. Yet, the people who later testified described a very different household: intense control, screaming, and then allegations of sexual abuse. Rafael, how do we reconcile the outward image with what the brothers would later say was happening behind closed doors?
It's unfortunate, but not uncommon, Maya. Families with high social capital can be extraordinarily good at curating public images. The same traits that fuel professional aggression, discipline, charisma, ambition, can present as control or authoritarian parenting at home. In the Menendez case, José is described in multiple accounts as a driven, demanding patriarch. That's consistent across witnesses. Now, whether that escalation crosses into chronic sexual abuse is a different evidentiary question. From a psychological standpoint, secrecy, power differentials, and the family's social prominence all create fertile ground for abuse to be concealed, because victims fear disbelief and social fallout. So you have 2 simultaneous realities: the curated public life and a powerful private coercion dynamic.
And the brothers paint an especially dark picture. Erik alleging sexual abuse starting as young as 6. Lyle describing abuse that later stopped. The family moved from New Jersey to Beverly Hills in the early 80s, the Elm Drive house as a symbol of success, and, the brothers say, of entrapment. Do you find the consistency of their accounts, staying the same for decades, carries weight?
Consistency is one element, yes. Erik and Lyle have stuck to their narrative through trials and now through appeals and resentencing hearings. That durability raises plausibility for many. From a clinical perspective, many abuse survivors maintained the same core truth for years. But plausibility is not proof. We have to also consider the absence of contemporaneous medical records, CPS reports, or third-party disclosures that typically support abuse claims, especially when the alleged perpetrator is a prominent figure. So, as a clinician, I say, their consistency makes the claim plausible, not definitive. The question then becomes, what corroboration exists and what can we realistically expect given the family dynamics?
Right. And you mentioned the absence of contemporaneous documentation. One of the prosecution's big points at trial was that there were no hospital reports or police reports documenting sexual abuse prior to the murders. At the same time, the defense later presented testimony from therapists and family members about the family's dysfunction. Let's jump ahead to the day itself, August 20, 1989. Raphael, can you walk listeners through what happened that night, as the record shows?
Yes, the basic facts are, regrettably, stark. José and Kitty were in the family den that evening watching The Spy Who Loved Me. Lyle and Erik entered with Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns, guns they'd purchased 2 days earlier after trying to buy handguns but running into the handgun waiting period. José was shot 6 times. One of the shots to the back of his head was fatal. Kitty was shot 10 times, including a final, face-directed shot after she was already incapacitated, a point the prosecution later highlighted as evidence of overkill and rage. After the killings, the brothers drove to Mulholland Drive, disposed of the shotguns, and then, strikingly, went to a movie theater to buy tickets, which was part of what investigators later characterized as an attempt to construct an alibi. Upon returning, Lyle placed the 911 call, hysterical, crying, shouting, "Somebody killed my parents," and police arrived to a bloody, chaotic scene.
It's still such a jarring image. Those details, the shots, the movie, the 911 call. I want to talk about the gun purchases, because it's central to whether this looks premeditated. We know they tried to buy handguns, got thwarted by the waiting period, then bought shotguns at a Big Five store in San Diego on August 18th, using a stolen license to cover their identity. They purchased birdshot and buckshot. That forethought, that's the prosecution's premeditation evidence. Raphael, how does that factor into psychological interpretations of what happened?
It's powerful for prosecutors because pre-event planning, acquiring a weapon days in advance, securing a disposal plan, and staging an alibi fits classic premeditation. Psychologically, though, we have to consider that not all planning negates fear. In some trauma narratives, the threatened victim spends time preparing because they've learned that sudden escape isn't possible. Think of battered persons who plan an escape route, stash money, or keep a bag ready. That said, the level of methodical behavior here, 2 days for weapons, disposal, alibi, argues against a pure panic killing. It suggests either deliberate planning or a distorted, long-running perception of danger that became operable. The law will want imminence. Clinicians can say perceived inevitability may function as imminence for the victim, but the courtroom seldom accepts perceptions alone.
That distinction, perceived inevitability versus legal imminence, keeps coming up. Now, 2 months after the murders, Erik confesses to his therapist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. He tells the doctor about planning, the killings, the alibi. Oziel records the sessions secretly and shares details with his mistress, Judah Lawn Smith, who later tips off police. That therapist breach becomes a huge legal story. Raphael, from an ethics and clinical perspective, what's your read on Oziel's behavior?
Ethically, Oziel's conduct was problematic on multiple levels. Confidentiality is a bedrock of therapy. Recordings and private disclosures, even if the therapist fears consequences, should be handled under strict protocols and typically with informed consent or explicit legal exceptions. Oziel sharing with a lover was a personal boundary violation. Clinically, there are exceptions to confidentiality, if a patient is threatening imminent harm to another, for instance, but the threshold for breaking privilege is high. And in the courtroom, that breach spawned a years-long privilege battle over what parts of the tapes could be used as evidence. So Oziel's behavior complicated an already messy case. It helped bring the brothers' admissions into the light, but also injected legal uncertainty and ethical questions about how far a therapist can go to protect others.
Pause here, because this is such a knot. The tapes are used to show planning and calm discussion about the killings, but a key tape, the explicit account of the murders, was excluded by the California Supreme Court in 1992 as privileged. Other tapes were allowed, which prosecutors used to show premeditation. Raphael, how should listeners think about what those tapes actually reveal about motive or state of mind?
Listeners should hear them as pieces of a mosaic, not the whole picture. The admissible tapes included discussions about planning and feelings, but not the explicit crime description, according to the court's ruling. Tapes that show a calm recounting or strategic talk can be used to argue that the brothers weren't acting in an immediate panic. But clinically, someone rehearsing a narrative in therapy is not always the unfiltered truth. Patients sometimes rationalize or walk through events in ways that make them understandable to themselves. So, evidence from therapy can point to premeditation, sure, but it can also reflect a patient's attempt to process acts that were, to them, complex and layered with fear, humiliation, and shame. The courtroom interprets it one way. A clinician will always ask deeper questions about why the person is telling the story in that way.
Let's move to the trials. The first trials, 1993 and 1994, were televised gavel to gavel on court TV. The images of two young men in sweater vests crying across a courtroom were seared into the national consciousness. The defense, led by Leslie Abramson for Erik, chose a bold path: admit the killings and argue extreme abuse and a kill-or-be-kill belief. Prosecutors pushed financial motive, the spending spree, Rolex, Porsche, restaurant investment, arguing greed. Jury 1 and Jury 2 hung. Then the second trial, 1995-1996, without cameras, with new prosecutors, a new tenor, resulted in convictions. Raphael, what changed between the television spectacle and the quieter second trial, from a psychological or jury dynamics perspective?
Several things changed. The court TV era turned the first trial into a soap opera where emotion and theatrical testimony can shape national opinion and even jury emotion. The presence of cameras sometimes incentivizes performative testimony. Defense lawyers put the human story center stage. By the second trial, Judge Stanley Weisberg banned cameras, which removed that performative dynamic. New prosecutors recalibrated strategy to emphasize hard evidence, gun purchases, disposal, spending. Another factor, the second trial tried both brothers together before a single jury, presenting a consolidated narrative that may have reduced juror sympathy. Psychologically, juries shown laxer procedural context may be swayed more by narrative empathy. A muted courtroom forces jurors toward evidence rather than spectacle. So it wasn't that the facts changed as much as the environment in which jurors decided what to believe.
And the second trial ended in first-degree murder convictions and life without parole. They begin decades behind bars, later earning college degrees in prison, marrying, mentoring other inmates. Some argue evidence of rehabilitation. Then, much later, the legal landscape shifts. In 2024 and 2025, California reforms around youthful offenders allow resentencing consideration for those under 26 at the time of the offense. The brothers, Lyle, 21, Erik, 18 at the time, become eligible, and in May 2025, Judge Michael Jessic resentenced them to 50 years to life, making them immediately eligible for parole. Raphael, how do we square the moral outrage many still feel at parricide with the logic of youthful offender reform?
It's a collision of two moral logics. On one hand, society places parricide among the most egregious crimes. There's an almost sacred expectation that people will not harm their caretakers. On the other, reformers argue that neuroscience and developmental psychology show young adults' brains, particularly impulse control and decision-making regions, aren't fully mature until their mid-20s. California's law reflects that understanding and the idea that someone sentenced to life without parole at 18 should have a chance to demonstrate growth. The question then becomes proportionality. Do the brothers' actions, the extreme brutality and the harm, justify life without parole? Or should we weigh their age, trauma histories, and rehabilitation? There's no purely empirical answer. This is a moral and legal balancing act.
I want to bring up the so-called Erik letter, a letter he allegedly wrote to his cousin Andy Cano in the late 1980s, in which Erik mentions being sexually abused. Defense lawyers call this a contemporaneous disclosure, which could be powerful corroboration that the abuse allegations weren't invented post-murder. Critics push back. Why did this letter surface only decades later? What about authenticity and chain of custody? Raphael, how persuasive is such a letter in your view?
A contemporaneous written disclosure would be highly persuasive because it predates motive development associated with the murders. Psychologists know that early disclosure is a strong corroborating factor. But the evidentiary weight depends on provenance. Who kept the letter? Why didn't it surface during trial? Can its contents be authenticated? The late emergence raises legitimate questions. Human memory, family loyalty, and legal strategy can all influence when and how physical documents appear. So clinically, I'd say it bolsters plausibility, but legally, it's subject to rigorous scrutiny. It's persuasive only if reliably authenticated and contextualized.
Let's talk about the other side. Some extended family members, acquaintances, and prosecutors have said they never saw signs of sexual abuse, that the brothers' sudden spending spree points to greed, and that the murder's brutality, especially the execution-style reloading and returning to finish Kitty, undermines the self-defense narrative. Raphael, from a behavioral standpoint, do you see patterns in post-crime behavior, spending, travel, that typically align with guilt or shock, or is it more complicated?
It's complicated. Post-offense behavior is heterogeneous. Some perpetrators panic and hide. Others make conspicuous purchases due to thrill-seeking or a psychological need to assert control. There are documented cases where killers spent money rapidly, sometimes because they feel invincible, sometimes because they must assert normalcy. In the Menendez case, the scale, hundreds of thousands within months, is hard to interpret as anything but suspicious. That was exactly the prosecution's argument. But trauma can produce erratic, self-destructive spending as well. People who have just committed a traumatic, identity-shattering act sometimes act impulsively to avoid the reality of their act. So the spending is strongly suggestive, but not determinative. You never get a single behavior that proves motive in isolation.
Something I keep circling back to is the legal standard for self-defense versus the clinical reality of battered child syndrome, a term the defense invoked to analogize to battered spouse syndrome. What does the science say about that analogy? Can years of abuse create a state of mind sufficiently distorted that a person reasonably perceives imminent danger, even when an outside observer would not?
Yes and no. Clinically, prolonged abuse, especially starting in childhood, can create complex PTSD, learned helplessness, and a chronic sense of danger. That can warp threat appraisal. An abused child may see threats where an outsider sees none, or may not see escape options available to others. The battered spouse analogy is useful in illustrating how chronic abuse constrains perceived choices. Legally, though, the threshold is higher. Self-defense often requires an objective component. Would a reasonable person in the defendant's position perceive imminent danger? Courts struggle with subjectivity. They'll accept expert testimony that trauma affects perception, but that rarely substitutes for the imminency requirement. So science can explain why someone might feel compelled to act violently, but it doesn't automatically satisfy legal standards for self-defense or justify homicide.
Short and no. Raphael, why didn't the brothers go to the police or to anyone else if they perceived such danger? That's a common question jurors and the public asked. Why kill instead?
Short answer: entrapment of thought. Longer answer: if someone has been systematically terrorized from childhood, their internal model of authorities may be that reporting will not help or will produce worse outcomes. They might fear disbelief, ostracism, institutional failure, or that their abuser will wield influence to make things worse. For boys abused by a powerful patriarch, reporting can feel doubly dangerous. Social stigma about male sexual victimhood and the father's social clout. So many victims either never tell or delay disclosure until a crisis point. That doesn't make killing legally justified, but it helps explain why some feel there was no alternative.
We need to cover the cultural shifts, too. When the trials were televised in the early 90s, many viewers couldn't or wouldn't accept that affluent fathers could sexually abuse their sons. By the 2020s, public awareness of male sexual victimization and trauma had shifted. The Netflix Monsters dramatization in 2024 revived interest. Raphael, how much does evolving public understanding change how we judge old cases like this?
Public understanding shapes interpretation, definitely. In the 1990s, tabloid framing emphasized greed and entitlement, which fit a cultural narrative about wealthy, spoiled kids. Today, increased awareness of male victimhood, coercive control, and long-term trauma can make the abuse narrative more credible to viewers. But legal facts don't change with public opinion. What does change is what people find plausible, and thus whom they partner with. Prosecutors, defense teams, journalists to retell the story. That's why new evidence, like the Erik letter, gets disproportionate attention now. The cultural context is more receptive. But we must be careful about allowing cultural sympathy to override evidentiary rigor.
Let's move to resentencing and parole. In 2025, Judge Michael Jessic reduced both brothers' sentences to 50 years to life, making them eligible for parole. The DA, Nathan Hochman, opposed resentencing, saying the brothers hadn't fully accepted responsibility and continued to lie about the abuse. On the other hand, DA George Gascon had earlier signaled support for reconsideration for youthful offenders. Raphael, what does parole eligibility mean in practical terms for people like the Menendez brothers? Is it a real path to freedom or more symbolic?
Parole eligibility is a procedural opening, not a guarantee. Practically, it means a parole board will evaluate them on criteria: acceptance of responsibility, remorse, insight into causation, institutional behavior, rehabilitation evidence, and release planning. For high-profile offenders like the Menendezes, public safety perceptions and victim family opposition weigh heavily. So yes, eligibility can lead to release, but it's a steep climb. It's also symbolic in that it acknowledges the penological principle that young offenders deserve consideration for later release. The question at parole is whether the board sees them as a present threat and whether they show genuine accountability, not just remorse rhetoric, but a deep reckoning with their actions.
Let me ask something direct, Raphael. Could genuine remorse and rehabilitation ever be enough in a case where the two victims were their parents? when some victims' families say release would be intolerable. In other words, should certain crimes be forever disqualifying?
This is where ethics and law collide. Some argue certain acts are so heinous they forfeit the right to be considered for reintegration. Others argue that lifelong exclusion contradicts the goals of rehabilitation and violates proportionality, especially when the offender was still developing. From a risk management and clinical perspective, what matters is whether the individual presents ongoing danger and whether they've internalized responsibility. But we also have to seriously weigh the ongoing harm to victims' families and societal values. There's no universal right answer. It's a normative judgment society must make through laws, parole boards, and political processes.
We've covered a lot of ground. Facts of the night, the tapes, the trials, the spending spree, the letter, resentencing. I want to pause and go back to one legal psychological knot, the timing of the guns, 2 days before. The defense says fear was building. The prosecution says premeditation. Raphael, how does timing like that get interpreted in your experience? Are there comparable cases where a short window between planning and killing still led to a self-defense claim accepted by courts?
Cases vary. There are instances where victims, believing escape is impossible, plan quickly, days or hours, then act. And courts have sometimes accepted lesser culpability if the perception of ongoing imminent danger was reasonable. But usually, when you see purchases, staged disposal, rehearsed alibis, and post-crime spending, courts construe that as planning consistent with malice aforethought. 2 days is a meaningful interval in legal terms. It tends to undercut claims of immediate reactive self-defense. That said, if a defendant can show that those 2 days were dominated by escalating, believable threats, documented threats, witness corroboration, that can change the calculus. It comes down to what contemporaneous evidence supports the claim of imminent danger.
Short reaction. Wow. Raphael, we should grapple with the emotional texture here. These are guys who've spent the bulk of their adult lives incarcerated. They've educated themselves, married, mentored. Some people who've watched their prison records say they've changed. Others, family members of the victims, prosecutors, say they still haven't accepted full responsibility because they continue to depict themselves as victims. How do we weigh decades of rehabilitation against the moral weight of the crime?
It's agonizing. Rehabilitation matters. Humans can and do change, but for many, nothing compensates for the loss of loved ones. Parole boards will look for more than good behavior. They look for insight into the destructive behavior pattern, an ability to name what they did fully and why, and an acceptance of consequences. Rehabilitation is not merely about staying out of trouble in prison. It's about a moral transformation that respects the victim's dignity. For the public, rehabilitation can sometimes feel like a small consolation when victims' families still grieve. That tension is the core of many resentencing debates.
Let's be clear about the unresolved questions, the reasons this case remains still unanswered. First, did the abuse happen as alleged? Second, were they in imminent danger that night? Third, should age, trauma, and rehabilitation ever outweigh the brutality and premeditation evidence? Raphael, anything else as a final unanswered piece?
Yes, we should add, how do we, as a society, evaluate claims of male sexual victimization when they intersect with crimes of extreme violence? And what standards do we demand for newly surfaced evidence decades later, like the Erik letter? And how do we avoid both wrongful conviction and wrongful exoneration? Finally, there's an institutional question. How should courts balance evolving science about trauma with the need for stable legal standards? Those are ongoing, unresolved tensions.
I want to give listeners a sense of dates and figures as we wrap so you can anchor this in time. The murders were August 20, 1989. Lyle was 21, Erik was 18. Lyle was arrested March 8, 1990. Erik turned himself in March 11, 1990. First televised trials in 1993, 1994 ended in hung juries. Convicted in the second trial in March 1996 and sentenced to life without parole. In May 2025, Judge Michael Jessic re-sentenced them to 50 years to life, making them eligible for parole. As of August 2025, they were scheduled for parole hearings. The Erik letter surfaced decades later and has been a point of renewed legal motion. Raphael, final question. If someone listening wants to understand how trauma research might influence similar cases going forward, what should they read or look for?
Look for interdisciplinary work, developmental neuroscience on adolescent brain maturation, trauma literature on complex PTSD and coercive control, and legal scholarship on battered person defenses and how courts interpret subjective fear. Good starting points are academic reviews in journals like Law and Human Behavior, neuroscience primers on adolescent development, and ethical guidelines from the American Psychological Association on therapist disclosures. And read the primary court opinions, California Supreme Court rulings that defined admissibility of therapy tape evidence in the Menendez case, because the law is as much a document trail as the clinical research.
Thank you, Raphael. This case forces us to hold conflicting truths in our minds at once, the evidence of planning and the possibility of long-term abuse, the visceral horror of what happened to José and Kitty, and the psychological explanations for why their sons might have done it. There may never be a neat, single answer. That's part of why the Menendez case keeps returning, because it sits at the intersection of family violence, class, celebrity, evolving science, and a legal system that must sometimes flatten complexity into a yes or no. Raphael, anything you want to leave listeners with?
Only this. When cases like this resurface, it's tempting to take sides quickly. But it's more useful to hold two things at once: empathy for trauma survivors and a commitment to rigorous evidence. The law should be informed by science, and the science should be offered with humility.
Wise. For listeners who want further reading, we'll include sources from today's conversation in the episode notes: Britannica, History, PBS, Washington Post, and court records. Thank you, Rafael Cortez, for walking through this with me, and thank you for listening. If you have thoughts or questions about this episode, reach out. Email stillunanswered@podmail.org or find us on social. Next week, we'll look at another cold case where new science has reopened old wounds. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. This has been Still Unanswered.